Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chantel, and today I'm going to do something a little bit different than what I usually do in these videos, and I hope that I can manage to do it without having written any notes. This is probably a video that I should have written notes for, but I'm really bad at actually sitting down, putting my thoughts together, making outlines, writing scripts. I'm quite bad at it. But yeah, so in this video, I am going to do something that I tend not to do very often, which is I'm gonna wade a little bit into the discourse because there's a few videos that I've seen recently that the YouTube algorithm has recommended to me, and a couple of which I've actually watched, that I find a little bit concerning with regard to assumptions about sexual content in media, books specifically, adolescent kids, and censorship, and sort of that weird combination of those three topics. And I want to pick apart some of what I've been seeing and some of the concerns that I have with it. So join me, won't you, on this little journey we're going to go on. So yeah, I've recently seen a few videos sort of pop up via the algorithm in my recommendations. Most of these videos have the same basic argument, which tends to boil down to kids are reading smutty literature, and what are we gonna do about that? And on the surface of it, that can seem concerning. Children are reading sex? Children are reading porn? Children are reading erotica? Oh no. But there's a few things that I really want to unpack about some of these videos and the arguments that they're kind of implicitly making that I find kind of concerning. First is that, of course, there's an underlying assumption in all of these videos that kids being exposed to fictional depictions of sex is like somehow inherently harmful or bad or wrong, or it's going to do something to them that is going to cause them harm. That's always the underlying assumption, right? If you're worried about kids being exposed to fictional sex, that's always the underlying assumption, right? Is that that exposure is going to somehow be harmful to them. And I want to clarify, when I'm talking about kids reading smutty literature, I'm primarily talking about teenagers, right? We're almost always talking about adolescent kids that are reading smutty literature. I promise my 6-year-old nephew, he didn't have any interest in that. None at all. None at all. So we're mostly talking about teenagers, right? And I just find the underlying assumption of these videos that teenagers being curious about or reading about fictional depictions of sex is somehow inherently harmful to be really problematic on its face, and to be really shockingly somewhat connected to like far right-wing rhetoric around kids and sexual content. It strikes me as being very right-wing, particularly when it's coming from people who I would assume are generally not right-wing and probably consider themselves relatively progressive, relatively liberal in their politics and in their, you know, particularly in their social politics. And yet when it comes to kids, some of us seem to still have a very prickly or problematic idea in our heads of what adolescent kids are actually doing and how harmful this may be. Now, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, I've never seen any evidence to indicate that there is any harm that comes from a teenager reading a book that has explicit sex scenes in it. I don't know if any studies have been done to this effect. I know that studies have been done studying the effects of violence in certain kinds of media on adolescents, and that has shown not a strong correlation. So like, there's not a strong correlation between playing a violent video game and being a violent person in real life. Playing a violent video game can potentially give you violent thoughts in the short term, some violent thoughts in the very short term, but there is not a strong long-term correlation between the two, and I can't imagine there's any kind of strong long-term correlation between exposure to sex and teenagers. So to me, I just find that really problematic when a lot of people start making videos with that sort of underlying assumption without questioning that assumption or without even thinking about that assumption at all, right? The assumption is just sort of inherently baked into the argument that somehow a 15-year-old reading an adult romance novel with sex scenes in it is like bad and harmful and needs to be stopped, when there's no, like, where do you have any like actual evidence to back that up? Do you have any even just anecdotal evidence to suggest that that is somehow harmful, other than, I don't know, your own inherent biases that, sex is somehow icky and gross and kids should be kept away from it? I've done a little bit of research into things like, the best way to sort of do sex education with kids, even quite young kids, because having young children in my life, young kids ask a lot of questions, and as, I'm not a parent, but I am an aunt, and I want to be, able to, if I can't just send him to his parents, to be as honest as I can about when he does have questions like that. So I've done a little bit of research into sort of early childhood psychology and sex ed and things, and every study that I've read suggests that the best way to make sure kids and teenagers have a healthy relationship with sex, with their own sexuality, with consent, with boundaries, with safe sex, with preventing the spread of STIs, with preventing teenage pregnancy, is to be honest and open with them and be willing to have honest conversations with them and not be restrictive and not treat it as something that's shameful. And I think if we're talking about fictional sex, why should we treat it as something that's shameful or weird or gross? I don't think that's productive. I think that depictions of sex in art, human sexuality is as much a part of the human experience as literally everything else that's a part of the human experience, and thus it is just as much a valuable thing to talk about and to depict in our art as anything else. And a lot of artists over the centuries have agreed with me in various ways, and restricting access to things that teenagers might be curious about seems to me to be counterproductive. And I don't think it's a good idea in general. And it concerns me when I see people making videos that are essentially carrying water for far right-wing bigots and wannabe book banners, because these are exactly the same kinds of arguments that people make when they're trying to ban, like, Heartstopper from school libraries, right? Which is that somehow kids being exposed to queer characters is harmful, and thus any book that depicts that content should be removed from, from where children have access to it. And I don't think that works. I don't think that works, and I don't think it's good. I don't think it's helpful in any sense of the word. So yeah, that's what I got. And also, this does connect to censorship in some ways, because I've also seen people in some of the comments of some of these videos suggesting, like, basically suggesting censorship as an answer to this problem that doesn't actually seem to be a problem. Things like a rating system for books. And I don't like that. As someone who has studied a lot of, I did a lot of work in grad school on the history of film censorship in America, and I know a fair amount about how, like, the American film rating system works. And while it has certainly gotten better in the past 15 to 20 years, it's far from perfect, and it definitely does constitute a form of censorship. Having a rating system absolutely constitutes censorship in ways that are not necessarily immediately obvious, in the same way that just having, like, content restrictions are, you know, pretty glaringly obvious, right? Just having a rating system causes a lot of problems on the back end in some ways, right? Because you get into a situation where this is what has happened with films, right? Where R-rated movies just don't make as much money at the box office traditionally. And so what happens is a lot of filmmakers are pressured by studios to make sure that their films end up with a PG-13 rating, because then they can make more money that way, because it's less restrictive. And then you end up with artists self-censoring in order to get the rating that will get them the approvals, that will get them into the most theaters, that will get them the biggest audience. And I can't help but think something like that might very well happen in publishing if publishing were to institute some kind of a rating system. One of the other big issues with a rating system is, of course, ultimately, who is going to determine what kinds of content gets what kind of rating? Who is going to do that? Who is going to be the arbiter of what is a PG rated book versus what is an R rated book? I'm just using, again, I'm sort of mapping the American film rating system onto a hypothetical book rating system, just because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. But yeah, who's going to determine that? Who's it going to be? Are you going to have just like one person who determines that? Are you going to have a committee of people who determine that? If you do have a committee, who are those people going to be? Are they going to be somehow experts in the field? Are they going to be employees of the publishers? Are they going to be marketing executives? Are they going to be experts in, I don't know, child psychology or early childhood development? Are they going to be parents of young children? Are they going to be registered Democrats? Registered Republicans? Are they going to be members of churches? What's that going to look like? There's a whole host of problems that come up when you start talking about a rating system, which is highly problematic, right? I'm not saying absolutely nothing should have a rating system ever. I'm just saying these are the kinds of issues that you really need to think about if you're going to start seriously suggesting any kind of censorship, because a rating system, again, is absolutely a form of censorship. 100% it's a form of censorship. And any form of censorship you need to be really, really, really careful about before you seriously consider it, before you seriously think about instituting it, because it's going to have lots of unintended repercussions, potentially, for a very long time. And you can see that if you spend any amount of time studying the history of, again, American film censorship, the Hays Code, the MPA rating system. it's had large repercussions throughout history, right? And throughout American film history and throughout American culture more broadly. So, like, you really got to think about it. You know, the other thing I've seen is this idea that publishers are, like, stealthily trying to market adult romance novels to kids. And I honestly think that's just really funny because, first of all, I don't like the cartoony romance covers that they do nowadays. I don't like them. I think they're pretty ugly, honestly. I would much rather walk around carrying a cover with a shirtless Fabio on it than, like, whatever this is. I don't care for it. I think it's silly. But, like, they're not marketing these books to kids. That's not the reason for these covers, right? Romance as a publishing genre doesn't need to be marketed much to anybody, honestly, because it's the most profitable genre in publishing and has been for decades and will continue to be for decades more. It's not going anywhere. Plenty of people seek it out. It is the bread and butter of the publishing industry is romance. They don't need to market romance novels to kids. They simply don't. They have a large enough audience. They're not struggling. So it's just absolutely silly to me for anybody to suggest that, like, the whole cartoony romance cover thing is, like, some kind of ploy to trick children into reading smutty literature. That's, it's absurd. It's absurd. That's just not what's happening. Quite frankly, I think if you are a parent and if you are concerned about what your kids may or may not be reading or engaging with in terms of art, media, pop culture, I think ultimately the way to go about addressing those concerns is to just have conversations with your kids about the things that they're engaging with, about the art that they like, the music that they listen to, the books that they read, the movies that they watch, the TV that they like. Just talk to them. Just have some conversations. I know it can be really hard to have conversations with your kids sometimes. It can be really hard to have conversations with anybody sometimes that are really honest and open and emotionally vulnerable. But that's how we deal with this, right? Like, that's how we deal with it. And if you don't want your kids to be engaging with a certain kind of content, regardless of what that content is, it's not that difficult to look up content warnings for most things online. It's generally pretty easy. A quick Google search will usually pull up the content warnings of most major book releases, film, television, video games, whatever. So it's not like parents don't have tools available to them if they want to make use of them. Ultimately, I really do think that kids reading smut is kind of a non-issue, and I don't really understand why I've seen multiple, again, seemingly well-meaning, left-leaning, socially progressive people sort of kind of fear-mongering about it, because it just seems like a non-issue. And the other thing I will say, anecdotally, because this is purely anecdotal, so, you know, you could take it or leave it. But, you know, as a teenager, I definitely read some smutty literature. And most of the people I know also did. And as far as I'm aware, it didn't harm any of us. It just didn't. I'm, in fact, asexual, which I've mentioned on this channel a few times, but it's true. I am asexual and aromantic. And, yeah, reading a lot of smut as a teenager did not make me asexual and aromantic. I always was. That didn't really have any effect on it. and I'm certainly not any kind of nymphomaniac. I don't think I have an unhealthy relationship with sex and boundaries because I read some smutty romance novels when I was 15 or 16 years old. It's really not that big of a deal. I know it's really easy to get really het up about things like this, especially on social media, when the algorithm really wants us to be angry and outraged and concerned all the time. But I think seeing it just like a TikTok video of some teenagers reading whatever, the smutty hockey romance novel or whatever, is like not a big deal. It's just not. I don't think it's anything that anybody really needs to be concerned about. And again, if a parent is concerned about what their kid may or may not be reading, just talk to them about it. Just talk to them about it and have a conversation, and, you know, make sure you develop a relationship with your kid that allows them to feel comfortable talking to you about things and being honest about this kind of stuff. And I think that's probably okay. As long as you do that, you're probably okay. So yeah, I don't know. That's all I had to say about the whole, oh my gosh, kids are reading smut kind of thing that I've seen popping up on my algorithm a couple of times. Again, I don't know why exactly the algorithm showed me these videos. Apart from the fact that I, you know, occasionally watch videos talking about book banners, and there is, I think, some tangential connection between the two. And in fact, again, my concern about these kinds of videos is that the people who are making them are, hopefully unwittingly, but nonetheless, they are carrying water for the kinds of people who want to ban books. And I don't like that. I think that's a problem, and I would hope that the people who make these videos would think about what they're doing and think about the assumptions that they're operating under a little bit before they make more of these fear-mongering videos. Because in our current political climate especially, I don't think we need any more fear-mongering. Not unless it's absolutely necessary, and in this case I really don't think it's necessary. So maybe we can cool it with the fear-mongering about are the kids all right, and are the kids reading the sex. It's probably okay. It's probably okay. Anyway, if you have any thoughts, questions, concerns, I guess if you want to yell at me in the comments, you can, but if you're actually yelling at me, I'll probably just delete the comment. But yeah, if you have actual, like, studies done about kids and sexual content in fiction, I would be interested in reading that. Again, I've seen studies focused mostly on violent content in media, but I haven't seen much in the way of sexual content in media. So I would be interested in seeing that if it exists. So if you've got some of that, leave them in the comments. And next week we'll probably get back to our regularly scheduled talking about the books that I'm reading. And yeah, that's all I got. So leave a like if you want, subscribe if you would like to hear me talk about books that I'm reading, because I usually do that. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye.